Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Pyongyang has threatened an atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean in response to Trump's threat to destroy the DPRK. Can we take any of these provocations literally? During the just concluded CPC Congress, Xi Jinping spoke of how culture is the country's soul. How important is cultural soft power as China commands increasing economic and political power? And we begin today's program with the DPRK issue, or the North Korea issue. The DPRK's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho recently warned that a possible atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean should be taken literally. He said Pyongyang may consider conducting the most powerful detonation of a hydrogen bomb amid rising tensions with the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Mattis is visiting South Korea ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's trip to Asia next week. Mattis is emphasizing the Trump administration's push for a diplomatic solution to the problem, but he also has said that the U.S. is prepared to take military actions if the North does not halt its development of missiles that could strike the entirety of the United States. So, will Trump's forthcoming Asia tour encourage the DPRK give up its nuclear ambitions, or the other way around? We are now joined by a strong panel. With us here in Beijing, Zhao Tong, associate in the Carnegie's Nuclear Power Policy Program based at the Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome to our program. In Medford, the U.S., we have Sun-Yong Lee, a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at the Tufts University. Welcome, Professor. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. I want to welcome the three of you. Gentlemen, may I begin with you, Professor Lee? How should we understand the remarks given by the Defense Secretary of the United States visiting right now South Korea? He talked about three words which we haven't heard for a long time: complete, irreversible, and also verifiable. Remember, those three words were used during the six-party talks when we talk about the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Those three words are being repeated this time. Interesting.
Well, CVID, so-called complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. That formulation appears on every single UN Security Council resolution. It appears in U.S. sanctions legislations against North Korea. That is the stated goal, one that is a fleeting goal at this point, probably. I think Mattis is trying to reaffirm the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea, trying to send a strong message to North Korea on the eve of President Trump's visit to the region. Don't do anything drastic like a hydrogen bomb test. You know, of the two very specific threats the North Korean foreign minister made during his visit to New York in September, I ask you again, and our viewers, of the two, the right to shoot down a U.S. spy plane or any plane outside their territorial airspace and the hydrogen bomb test in the Earth's atmosphere, which is the greater threat, which is more likely to trigger a military response from the United States? I say it's the shoot down which will kill American servicemen. The hydrogen bomb test will, of course, be a grave provocation, but will not be seen around the world as cause for war. Therefore, it is highly likely that North Korea will do it.
I see. Mr. Yelan, do you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think both things could lead to war, or you could have a miscalculation. So all this hot rhetoric on both sides is really not doing anybody any good. And I'm afraid that you know, the provocative moves on both sides so far are not good either.
I'm not sure whether the U.S. at this point, at least during this trip in South Korea, is that provocative, at least by the words on the paper. However, Mr. Zhao, we heard different tones coming from different members of the delegation. The Joint Chief of Staff of the United States is, rather than the Defense Secretary, talking about the right for the United States to defend itself and also to retaliate once there's more further provocation from the North. How should we understand this apparent mixed messages coming from the same delegation?
I think there is a real division of views within the White House. Very recently, some senior officials in the State Department, like Joseph Yun, who is the top diplomat to North Korea in the United States, he openly expressed the view that White House has been working to handicapping diplomacy with North Korea. So apparently there is a major difference of view, especially between the senior State Department officials and President Trump himself. So it's not surprising that different people are talking different things. And also in my private discussions with senior American military officials, they also are very skeptical about the feasibility of a military option against North Korea. But President Trump wants to appear very tough and wants to seriously consider the military option. Therefore, they, the military, have to prepare a military option. So we have to recognize there are a variety of views within the White House.
On the other hand, the North Koreans are not staying there either. They are busy as well, at least when it comes to provocative words. Professor Lee, earlier we talked about the atmospheric nuclear test on the Pacific Ocean. What would that mean in terms of the North's capability demonstration to the rest of the world? And how does that say about a real danger it would pose to the United States?
Well, one of North Korea's highest long-term strategic goals is to push the United States to downgrade its support for its alliance with South Korea. And of course, North Korea has been losing that systemic contest for pan-Korean legitimacy vis-a-vis South Korea. So the way to be able to bully South Korea, perhaps even prevail over it one day, is to get the U.S. troops out of there. How do they do that? They credibly threaten to nuke a major U.S. city. So they need to demonstrate that they have the capability to marry a nuclear warhead on an ICBM, and that means they have to test it. So that day will come eventually, despite all the grave implications of the first nuclear test in the Earth's atmosphere in decades.
Mr. Zhao, do you concur what Professor Lee just said? What is likely to be the capability with this test, if there is a test?
I think North Korea has achieved the basic capabilities to do that. The missile, the intermediate range and ICBM missiles are certainly capable of delivering a certain payload to several thousands of kilometers away. So it should be capable of delivering a thermonuclear warhead to the Pacific Ocean. The only remaining technical question is whether North Korea is capable of building a reliable re-entry vehicle that can survive the re-entry of the missile trajectory. And maybe that's one of the reasons North Korea is saying it is going to do so, because it wants to demonstrate openly to everyone that it can build a robust missile with a robust re-entry vehicle, and everything can actually work. So that's how it delivers a message of deterrence to the United States.
We're going to continue our discussion, gentlemen, but for now, let's bring in this piece of breaking news in the Spanish region of Catalonia, where Parliament has just voted to declare independence. And the Spanish Senate has just approved direct rule in Catalonia. The Catalan Parliament approved the motion to declare independence with 70 votes in favor, 10 against, and 2 abstentions. Thousands of pro-independence demonstrators gathered in front of the entrance of the Catalan Parliament to show their support before the vote begins. Of course, that is an evolving story. CGTN is going to bring you more as it further continues. For now, let's come back to our discussion. One other thing I want to ask you, Mr. Zhao, is with President Trump to China, the trip, going to South Korea first and then China. And of course, he has been lowering his rhetorics over the past. The phone call with the Chinese President Xi Jinping after 19th Party Congress just concluded, and certainly this time you see the cabinet members, the Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, also use very similar level of tones as well. What would this mean to you as a China scholar?
Well, we did see Trump actually praising China for taking tough pressures against North Korea. Actually, Trump said China is helping, but Russia is now helping. But with that said, I do think Mr. Trump might see an opportunity to put more pressure on China, because he might believe that President Xi is in a better place to take tougher sanctions against North Korea, because after the conclusion of the 19th Party Congress, maybe the Chinese leader will have more bandwidth in addressing the North Korean threat. And after he reassuring his East Asian allies, South Korea and Japan, I think the message he will deliver in Beijing is, look, it's the perfect time that we further enhance international isolation against North Korea. So I'm afraid China will be under greater pressure from the United States to embrace a comprehensive embargo against North Korea.
Mr. Elan, that's why we need to go to you right now. What is, even if it is at its primitive stage or at its chaotic stage, what do you see is this way of the Trump administration to push for a solution of the DPRK nuclear issue? Is it pressuring China combined with preparation militarily toward the DPRK? What is it? How to characterize it?
Well, I think the United States is rattling the saber, but at the same time, of course, Tillerson on this, Mattis on this pass is stressing negotiations. So, you know, you have good cop and bad cop. But I really think they probably will pressure China to do more in sanctions. I don't think China is going to do that much, and I don't think even if they did, it would work. I think North Korea feels that after what happened to Libya and Iraq, Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, and Libya gave up their nuclear program, but those leaders were both taken out. I think North Korea looks on nuclear weapons as deterring the U.S., as you pointed out, and I think that's what's going to happen in the long term. The United States is just going to have to, and the rest of the world is going to have to deter a nuclear North Korea with weapons that can be delivered with long-range missiles. That's where we're headed.
Where we're heading, how far are we from there? Of course, earlier you have talked about, Professor Lee, the capabilities of DPRK at this point. But during this process, from where we are to the possibility of it become a nuclear nation, which the world will not recognize, of course, what would this process mean, particularly this visit by President Trump to China?
Well, I'm sorry to say, North Korea is a de facto nuclear state. We all know that. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test more than a decade ago in October 2006, and the latest test in September showed that North Korea has the capability to even develop and test a hydrogen bomb. So North Korea is a veritable nuclear state. What does that mean for North Korea and the region? Will North Korea stop there with apparent second strike capability, deterrence capability? No. Of course, nuclear weapons give North Korea tremendous power of self-defense and deterrence, but North Korea won't be satisfied here. It needs to prove, it needs to show that it can nuke a major U.S. city almost at will, and it's not there yet. So North Korea will get there eventually. How soon? I don't know. But, you know, North Korea has a habit of making peace overtures in the early part of the new year, and now we're headed toward the end of 2017, which has been a banner year for North Korea. So I think there's a good chance North Korea will resort to another major provocation before the year's end, and then say, let's let bygones be bygones, let's start anew in 2018. That's North Korea's strategy.
But what about the U.S. strategy, Professor Lee? I mean, with President Trump's visit, top on his agenda is the DPRK nuclear issue. Besides pressuring China with further sanctions, what else can he do? And any strategy do you identify from the United States? Any chance that the United States might have a discussion more above the water with the DPRK for some kinds of possibility to resolve the current everlasting crisis?
If North Korea causes more headaches, more trouble for the Trump administration, and then makes a dramatic gesture of concession and says, let's talk, there is a chance that the Trump administration will accept North Korea's proposal for direct talks. We saw that with the Bush administration many years ago, despite the stated hostility, rhetorical bellicosity and ideological hostility on the part of President Bush himself against Kim Jong-il. So that possibility is always there. For now, though, I think the Trump administration is resolved to try to enforce sanctions, put more pressure on China, yes, but also through diplomatic channels try to galvanize the world, other UN member states, to do their part to downgrade and cut off even diplomatic relations with North Korea. Will that produce any results anytime soon? No, because sanctions enforcement takes time. It will take at least 2 years, maybe 3 years, to have any kind of impact.
We have seen recently of some so-called Western media reports talking about a DPRK steadfast still despite sanctions. Having said that, though, Mr. Zhao, here is the thing for you. The 19th Party Congress is being considered as an important signpost for China's contemporary politics. And as a result of that, there are different kinds of stages for China, it seems, the so-called new era. And of course, diplomacy and the philosophy behind the diplomacy, the logics behind it, could also be evolving as a result. So how would that, Mr. Zhao, if you are reading the tea leaves in your cup, what does that mean, possibly, for China's attitude on the DPRK nuclear issue and on the upcoming visit by President Trump when the two leaders are going to discuss about the DPRK nuclear issue?
Well, at one level, President Xi Jinping made it very clear that China needs to take a more active leadership role in global governance. And that means China will continue to uphold important international principles and norms. And non-proliferation is one of those important international norms. So that means China will never retreat from its position that the ultimate goal of the Korean Peninsula has to be a denuclearized North Korea. However, President Xi also said during the 19th Party Congress that China will never swallow the bitter fruit of allowing its key national interests being undermined by other countries. And in the North Korean issue, China is actually under that threat because the Trump strategy is actually shifting the burden to China, letting China take all the sacrifice and the costs for sanctioning North Korea. So China, I think, will continue to resist that in order to defend its own legitimate interests, and will continue to promote a more pragmatic approach of trying to freeze North Korea's capability in the near term.
Mr. Eland, it is being very much advocated from China about the so-called double suspension, namely the United States, South Korea suspend the military exercises, further so-called provocation as China sees it toward the DPRK, and let the DPRK also suspend its further nuclear tests and also hydrogen bomb tests. So this is what China proposed, and China takes pride in it. It suggests that this is one of those, productive way to get to some result, at least. So it seems that China is quite confident in its approach toward diplomacy on this issue, particularly after the 19th Party Congress. So, Mr. Eland, what would this mean for the Trump administration when it comes to further, or efforts trying to further push pressure on China? Will it succeed, or actually it could go exactly the opposite direction, Mr. Eland?
Yes, I think so. I think the Chinese could resist that. I don't think, because North Korea has been a friendly country to China, even an ally in some senses, they don't want the regime to collapse because they would have a unified Korea on their border. They don't want the regime to collapse because of refugees, etc. So I doubt that pressure on China is going to have that much effect on this whole thing. And I also think that actually China's suggestion to me sounds pretty good, but the U.S. doesn't want to do that because they think that this will drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States, and that the alliance this was a blow to the alliance. But, these alliances that we have in the Pacific, I think we really ought in the long term think rethink these. I mean, South Korea and Japan are wealthy countries, and they should be able to defend themselves from North Korea without the United States. And I just don't see, I see these alliances dragging the U.S. into conflicts that we don't need anymore. And I think we're overextended given the fact that we spend half the world's military spending, but we only have less than a quarter of the GDP, so we're overextended. So why not let these countries do more? I think that was Trump's original orientation, but I think the American bureaucracies have beat it out of him, these advisors that he has, and he's retreated from that. But I think his original line of reasoning was pretty well, even though he's not familiar with the details of things.
Mr. Zhao, you want to respond to that?
Well, with due respect, I disagree a little bit with our American experts' view that China opposes the reunification of Korean Peninsula. There is certainly a variety of views in China on this issue, but apparently China itself is also a country that has yet to achieve national reunification. And the majority view here, I think, does support Korean reunification. The only issue is there should be more discussion between China and the United States, and hopefully also involving South Korea, about what should be the right security structure on the Korean Peninsula after reunification is achieved, and also how to reform the UN Security Alliance to make it better capable of addressing today's security threats in the region. I think those issues need more discussion among these countries.
See, gentlemen, this is what we talk about. This issue about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue is becoming ever more complex because there are so many issues related to it, and there's not much confidence and trust among all parties about any of those issues, this included. Professor Lee, you want to come in here and talk about, help us to understand really, at this juncture, besides finger pointing, is there any specific things that can be achieved on this issue during President Trump's visit to South Korea, during President Trump's visit to China?
Well, with respect to U.S.-South Korea relations, I think something can be achieved, which is to improve the bilateral relationship. It is very strong on the surface, but there's an undercurrent of tension between Mr. Trump and Mr. Moon of South Korea. So the more meetings, discussions the two leaders have, the better it will be to get back on the same page. With respect to the United States not being further involved in Korean affairs or defending Japan, all that would be good if it were not for the fact that the last time the U.S. did that, withdrawing troops from South Korea in the summer of 1949, a year later there was a war. Why? Because North Korea is fundamentally a revisionist state. It is not happy with the international environment, the very unfavorable international environment which it finds itself in as the permanent inferior backward Korean state. So if the U.S. were to relieve itself of its duty to defend South Korea, the more tempting it will be for North Korea to bully South Korea and perhaps even start a war of liberation.
All right. And before we go, I want to have every one of you one simple sentence and one sentence only about what can we expect really when it comes to the nuclear issue on Korean Peninsula with President Trump's visit to Northeast Asia. Let's go with Mr. Elan first.
I think we're lucky if we don't have a war because of the heated rhetoric and a miscalculation. I don't think the U.S. has a duty to defend a South Korea that now has 40 times the GDP of the North.
Professor Lee.
The North Korean nuclear issue will only be resolved when things get a lot worse for the region and for U.S. security, and or if South Korea and Japan go nuclear in the future, as far-fetched as that sounds, it is still within the realm of the possible.
Wow. Mr. Zhao.
Well, I think North Korea might continue to conduct some provocations because it has the technical need to do so, but it's also fortunate that there are going to be multiple opportunities for the regional national leaders to meet and touch base. Besides the U.S.-China summit, the Chinese and South Korean presidents are going to meet at least at the APEC summit and also the East Asia summit meeting. So it's a very good opportunity for high-level diplomacy.
We'll see what's going to happen. Zhao Tong, Sun Yong Lee, Ivan Elan. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much for your views and your insights. And you're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, still to come on our program. During the just concluded CPC Congress, Xi Jinping spoke of how culture is the country's soul. Hundreds of years ago, China's cultural exports were sought after throughout the world. And how can modern China rekindle its cultural prestige? That's going to be the question. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. China's culture industry has grown to over 3 trillion RMB, or about 450 billion US dollars. That accounts for over 4% of China's total GDP. It has turned into the largest culture market in terms of published books, TV dramas, and movies. During the CPC's 90th National Congress, General Secretary Xi said culture is a country's soul. He also spent quite a lot of time in the report talking about how to nurture not only traditional culture but also that of modern life, saying the nation will only be strong if its culture is strong. And let's listen in.
Without full confidence in our culture, without a rich and prosperous culture, the Chinese nation would not be able to rejuvenate itself. We must develop a socialist culture with Chinese characteristics, inspire the cultural creativity of our whole nation, and develop a great socialist culture in China.
That's a quote coming from Xi Jinping. For more on China's cultural soft power and many other issues related to it, we are joined here in our Beijing studio by Mr. Huang Ping, long time no see, sir, co-chair of the International Institute Transculture and also co-organizer of China-EU High-Level Cultural Forum. Welcome to our program. Also joining us to have in our studio, once again, David Moser, Senior Advisor at the Yanqing Academy at Peking University, a master's degree program for foreign and Chinese college students to learn about Chinese culture.
That's right.
Welcome as well, David. I want to start with you, Mr. Huang. There's a lot of talk about culture, but certainly culture does not just mean cultural industries. It's not just money-wise. It's a lot more than that. How far are we from that term, so-called culture?
For me, but also for especially sociologists, anthropologists, historians, culture firstly means a set of ways of living, of thinking, of communicating each other, of the very ordinary people. And behind, it's a meaning of life, how people see a set of norms, values. Therefore, culture does not only belong to those cultural people in arts, in performances, in culture industry, but also actually belongs to everyone.
Yeah. Having said that, though, how much do we really talk about culture these days in our daily conversations? You know, China is on the run. David, you know this much better than anybody else. You've been in China for decades, observing how China is evolving. Economic development has been regarded as the top priority. Of course, things have changed, but how much culture is really in our daily conversation?
Yeah, culture tends to be associated, as Professor Huang said, with the elevated aspect of life, those lofty things like philosophy. And culture is actually a very neutral term that just actually refers to all the aspects of life that distinguish one particular civilization or peoples from another. So actually culture, if you come to China, the first thing you realize is this is a very, very different culture as a foreigner. And it's not just in its arts or its letters, but it's in its food, it's in its daily life, it's in its relationships between people. And I think that that's something that China, as it becomes well-known, more well-known now in the 21st century, more people are able to come here. That aspect naturally gets exported in terms of the people who are influenced by to come here.
China,
and that's all culture.
China is not lack of cultural phenomena. And yet, there has been apparently a lack of real research into the cultural phenomena. And you talk about the food or the tea or the, the interactions among the people. Professor Huang, in the specific speech given by Xi Jinping, he has also been talking about earlier about his responsibility as the head of state and as also the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party, to not to forget and not let the Chinese society forget about the 5,000-year-old traditional Chinese culture. Of course, you could argue traditional Chinese culture is only part of the Chinese culture. And yet, what about that big chunk of the Chinese culture? Professor Huang, have we done much research about that? Do we know much about our own culture, given the absence of research over the past decades, let's just say in the Chinese society and also in the Chinese schoolings?
I would think we have lots of research on culture from culture perspective, even in order to understand economic development, but from the cultural dimension. No mentioning of those research of our old history, literature, etc. But there is a kind of differences between a very consciousness or awareness of your own culture and something just take it for granted. So for many ordinary people, hundreds of millions of people, they took it for granted without necessarily recognizing with such a full consciousness.
Give me an example, if you can, sir.
Giving you an example, when Xi Jinping talks about the cultural confidence, he definitely means we need to be more consciousness about our own culture, values, norms, rather than naturally let it go, say thousands of years. Of course, continuity of the culture, very rich traditions, diversities of the Chinese cultures, etc., etc. It has been there. But as you said, during the past decades, several decades already, they emphasized so much on economic growth. Development
and before
first.
that, political campaigns.
Yeah, development first, economy first. But if you look at actually for the much longer history and how even in order for a sustainable development, for a inclusive development, for development for all, benefits to all, cultural dimension must be there and actually must be a foundation.
David, I know earlier we talked about this, and you disagree that traditional culture should, occupy a big chunk of the culture that we are talking about today when it comes to Chinese culture. What do you think is the Chinese culture, and what to you is the most treasurable, let's just say, as an observer?
Well, for me, you don't want to ask me because I'm a very much an academic. What attracted me first and still attracts me a lot to Chinese culture is the traditional philosophy. And I always thought that was one of China's great contributions to the world was its philosophy. That's not something that most Americans or most people care about. However, with China's rise and with more people understanding it, we are seeing many books written by Western scholars, American scholars, explaining Confucianism, explaining aspects of Chinese philosophy and thought to undergraduates at Harvard and different places, and saying, look, this is another way of conceptualizing the human sphere, and it's a very interesting one. And it has
Give me an example, if you can.
I can't think of the name right now, but there's a Harvard professor who has written a book talking about Confucianism and its relevance to American life. In fact, there's several books that try to do that. So that's one aspect. Chinese traditional culture is obviously the first thing you think of when you think of Chinese culture, the 5,000-year aspect. The calligraphy, of course, the food, the different aspects of the culture, its long history, its literature. But there's this other aspect that you see in like the modern culture with the analog being K-pop, whereas Chinese modern culture that has this soft power attraction, which can attract people even if they're not interested in China per se. They're interested in that phenomenon, in that music, or in that you know, piece of art. That's what needs to happen in China, and it is happening. But the question is, when will China have its K-pop, or when will it have its jazz music, or Hollywood movies, or you know? And this is something China is making headway in. But I think that China needs to get over the notion that their biggest selling point and all they have is its 5,000-year history. There's still a very vibrant new culture arising domestically, but they haven't been very successful in exporting it.
Interesting to talk about that, because there has been a lot of discussion of so-called the 4 new inventions of modern China, you know, namely mobile pay, you know, fast-speed train, things like that. That make people think about a fact that what is China invention? Of course, those technologies are from overseas originally, and yet with the China market and the China practice and update, it has changed overall. And that is exactly what we talk about, the so-called, you know, whether it's jazz or a movie or TV plays, all of these genres are not invented by China, so-called. It's coming from overseas, while China was learning over the past 4 decades, reform and opening up. But eventually, can China play it well, quote unquote, with all these things that they have learned from others? Or China will play it so well with the things that it originally has and originally invented? What exactly is China's advantage if we consciously discuss about this? Professor Huang.
I would think either traditional or
but
modern...
of course, on the other hand, does it really matter?
But either traditional or modern culture or Chinese culture, one thing you can see in common, that is Chinese culture and society and the people has been very open, learning. Nowadays we use the term inclusive. So it's a mixed, very mixed, multiple cultures.
Diversity.
Yeah, diversities. From within also towards the outside. That's how you have taken those examples, how China absorbed or taken or integrated, and also have its own input. It's a kind of mixture. But again, I think there has been a continuity there. That is openness, inclusiveness, and kind of learning attitudes, not only for our long history, but towards the outside, towards the future. And especially this is especially true amongst the younger generations.
David, you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And one of the dynamism of China's, of the United States soft power is in fact that most of those forms that we think of, like rock and roll, are actually the result of this confluence of different cultural aspects. You know, you have the black African slaves that were brought, you have classical music, you have all these sorts of influences. These are what create vibrant new art forms. China has cultural diversity. It needs to not be afraid of it. It needs to revel in it. It needs to allow its traditional forms, its musical forms, its calligraphy and everything, to change and evolve with the results of these foreign and outside, and even within its multicultural interior, and let new sort of forms arise. And I think one problem with China is it tends to be conservative with its old forms. It tends to say, well, but if you change you know, Peking opera into this, it won't be Peking opera anymore. China needs to get away from that and say, we welcome change, we welcome and we welcome input from the outside world.
Our discussion has become abstract, but at the same time very vivid. because this is such a huge topic, probably beyond any topic that we have ever discussed here in this program. When it comes to culture, it is about diversity. It is also about space and freedom to create diversity. And there are many other topics related to all of this. But for now, I want to thank all of you for being with us. Huang Ping, David Moser, really appreciate it. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Have a great weekend.